want to go from New York to California, you can do it in a few hours. There are many planes to take you there. Or perhaps you'd like to visit someone in another state. Nothing to it. Today, America is all one because all parts of it are connected by transportation. We take traveling for granted. Some of us even complain about it. And yet, it was not always this easy. America as a nation was formed by transportation. This is the story. The first settlers in America found a huge, wild, beautiful land. But the country was so vast, the mountains so high, they could only imagine what lay beyond them. How they longed to cross those mountains, but how could they ever do it? So at first they stayed along the eastern seaboard, and eventually a few villages sprang up further inland. There was little trade. Farmers grew what they needed for themselves and for their families. They almost never left the land. For those early Americans, travel was sometimes a necessity, seldom a pleasure. Horses were the chief means of transportation. People relied on a good, dependable horse hitched up to a buggy or a wagon. It would always get you there, provided you were not in a hurry and you weren't going too far. Long-distance travel was downright hardship. The Conestoga wagon was the first American contribution to transportation. But the wagon's top speed was only 3 miles an hour. At that pace, the country would never be settled. The steamboat was a great invention, the first time mechanical power had been applied to transportation. The steamboat was fine on water, but what would carry travelers swiftly across the land? Then in 1829, Peter Cooper introduced his tiny steam locomotive, the Tom Thumb. On its first run, the locomotive lost a race to a fast horse, but the idea worked. The train had come to America. On Christmas Day, 1830, the best friend of Charleston became the first regular passenger train on this continent. Everyone was enthusiastic. What was it like to ride one of those early trains? Well, a passenger wrote,
"This is the millennium, flying on wings of the wind at 15 miles an hour and leaving all the world behind."
America fell in love with the train. The trains became faster, more powerful. They were the wonder of the age, and they made life easier, more convenient, civilized. They carried the farmers' produce to market. They carried settlers. The railroads created trade, and trade created new towns. But that was only in the eastern part of the country. By 1860, there were 3,000 miles of track in America, more than in all the rest of the world combined. The tracks pushed as far as the banks of the Missouri River, and there they stopped. Beyond the Missouri lay more than 1/3 of the continent. Unsettled land, the home of the Indian. Only a few hunters and trappers had crossed it, and the people in search of gold in California. By 1855, there was a monthly stagecoach service, St. Louis, Missouri to Oregon and California. 2,700 miles in 25 days. It was a terrible trip. One traveler wrote,
"Almost 4 weeks of kidney jolting and bone cracking. Indians on the hill, bandits in the bushes. Read about it. Don't try it."
But Americans wanted their country to stretch as far as the Pacific Ocean. It would take more than stagecoaches to do that. So Congress decided there must be a Transcontinental Railroad. One company, the Union Pacific, would begin in Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific would start in Sacramento, California. They would meet somewhere in between. It was a giant task. Never before had a railroad been built across 2,000 miles of wilderness. Everything had to be hauled more than 1,000 miles to where it was needed. The Union Pacific workers were Civil War veterans or new immigrants, mostly from Ireland. They were paid $2.50 a day in food. They worked 72 hours a week. After a year, they were across Nebraska, and 1,000 miles of wilderness still lay ahead. At the other end of the line, in California, the Central Pacific had its own trouble. A route had to be hacked and blasted through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Solid granite. They used Chinese in their work gangs. There were thousands of Chinese in California, men who had come to find gold, but were not welcome among the miners. They proved great workers. Theirs was the most terrible part of the whole Transcontinental Railway. They had no modern explosives to help them tunnel through the rock. They did most of it by pick and shovel. Hundreds of them were killed by falling boulders and snowslides in the winter. They built miles of wooden sheds along the precipice to protect the tracks. Some of them are there today and still in use. After 3 years of work, in the summer of 1868, they had finished the tunnels. They had cut through 20 miles of solid rock. No one had thought it could be done, but now they were through the mountains. Once on the flatland, the railroads raced towards the meeting spot. After all the hardship and the danger, the goal was nearly accomplished. The tracks from east and west would finally be joined. May 10, 1869, at Promontory, Utah, was the great day America had been waiting for. One locomotive drew slowly towards the other. At last, the mighty mountains had been crossed. The dream of those first immigrants had come true. The two coasts, Atlantic and Pacific, were physically united, and America was one country. This was the miracle of the Transcontinental Train. Now railroad was king. The railroads made it possible for America to develop into one of the greatest industrial nations in the world. Trains brought raw material to the factories. They carried goods and farm produce to markets that had never known them before. By 1890, trains had opened up all of America. The railroad station became the most exciting place in town. It was there you heard the latest news. Everyone wanted to ride on the trains. The railroad would take you to the city. It could even take you clear across the country. To people who still remembered stagecoaches, the railroad seemed a palace on wheels.
During 2 hours of comfort, I traveled the distance my parents, with hardship, covered in 2 months.
Railroad advertisements concentrated on the romance and the luxury of travel. Children were welcome aboard trains. Travel was educational and broadening, the railroad said. Then there were all the natural beauties of America, just waiting to be seen. Trains settled the West. There was plenty of land to be had, and train fares were slashed for settlers. Thousands of new immigrants from Europe flocked to America's plains. They created farms where there had only been sagebrush and tall grass. The railroads had unified America. They had settled the country, they had developed it. But farmers still had to hitch up the same old horse and buggy to go from home into town. The problem of fast, convenient personal transportation had not yet been solved. But help was on the way. They called it a horseless carriage, and when it appeared upon the scene in the 1890s, it seemed ridiculous. An engine in a box with wheels. Was this noisy gadget going to challenge the mighty train? But the automobile meant freedom and adventure. It could go places impossible for a train to travel. At first, the automobile was only for the rich, the elegant, or the devil-may-care. For those who could afford it, the automobile was all the rage. But how could a working man ever own one? It seemed impossible. Then, in 1908, Henry Ford built a revolutionary car. He called it the Model T, and he made it so inexpensive that anyone could buy it. Of course, ladies had to get in last. To save money, the door on the driver's side was only painted on and did not work. But people loved it. They could go anywhere, anytime. A new owner said,
I'd rather have a car than a bathtub. You can't drive a bathtub to town.
The Model T changed America's customs and her ways. Young people saw in it instant independence. Off for a ride in a car. Eventually, the Model T came to cost as little as $290. It was the product of the world's first assembly line. The more cars produced, the less each cost, the more were sold. By the 1920s, there were 5 million cars in America, and 80% of them were Model Ts. The automobile had created a new world. It had brought freedom of movement, independence. But people were still looking for a way to go even faster and farther. Some people actually wanted to fly. In 1908, Wilbur and Orville Wright tested their new flying machine for the United States Army. It was an historic occasion, the first public demonstration in America of their invention. The crowd was excited. Most of them didn't think the contraption could get off the ground. But it could, and it did. Few of the spectators that day realized that a whole new age was being born before their very eyes. Now more people built flying machines, but most Americans saw no practical use for them. They thought them gadgets, and they thought the people who flew them were lunatics. To most, flying was as remote as the man in the moon. In those days, people paid to see airplanes fly. There was always the possibility of a crack-up. World War I changed all that. The airplane was used as a military tool. It became faster, a little more reliable every day. It was romantic. It was new. Americans rushed to volunteer as pilots, but soon after the first American air units were sent to Europe, the war was done. What could the government do with all the planes it had built? Most people thought the airplane was useful only in wartime, so they decided to burn the thousands of airplanes which had never seen combat. Some few planes were saved for a new postal service. The first airmail was introduced in 1918. A young man named Charles Lindbergh was one of those early airmail pilots. Lindbergh was dedicated to flying. He thought that the airplane and America's future belonged together. So Lindbergh decided to risk everything, even his life, for what he believed in. In 1927, he took off from San Diego, California, to start an incredible adventure. He would fly first to New York, and then across the Atlantic alone in his single-engine monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. No one believed he could do it, but he did. 33.5 hours, and all alone. Enormous crowds waited to greet him when he landed on the airfield at Paris, and again in New York on his return to America. Aviation had caught the imagination and the heart of the country. Now more and more people wanted to fly. There were more and more cross-country flights for passengers. Even trips across the ocean became easier and increasingly popular. By the 1930s, America was linked by air to all the great continents of the world. The modern day of transportation had arrived. Now we have accomplished what seemed only a dream. We have crossed the mountains and seen all that lies beyond them. We have conquered the wilderness. Today we can travel anywhere in America we want to go. We have the great gift of mobility, but we have had to pay the price. Roads have eaten up the land we struggled so hard to conquer. There are almost 4 million miles of paved roads in America, a mile of road for every square mile of land, and even they are not enough. Our highways are jammed with automobiles. They pollute the air we breathe. Because of the automobiles, sprawling suburbs spread across the country. Passenger trains are almost non-existent. Railroads haul nearly half our freight, but commuter trains are dirty, crowded, unreliable. Our airplanes carry thousands of people, but they too pollute the air. And sometimes that air is so crowded, the planes cannot even leave the ground. And yet these problems created by transportation today are no greater than those at the beginning of our history. By perseverance and ingenuity, we met the great challenges of yesterday. 200 years ago, those problems seemed impossible, yet we found ways to solve them. The challenges which face us today seem even more difficult. But new times create new challenges and new solutions. The future is up to all of us. And that includes you.